It was the fall of 1983, in a quiet town in Ohio where nothing ever seemed to change. Families left their doors unlocked. Neighbors waved from across the street. Life moved slowly, predictably. Until one October night, when a 17-year-old girl vanished without a trace, and the town's sense of safety was shattered forever. Her name was Laura Bennett. She was bright, outgoing, and well-liked, the kind of girl everyone expected to go far. On the night of her school's autumn dance, Laura left the gymnasium around 10:45 p.m., telling her friends she would walk home. It was a short walk, 15 minutes at most, down a familiar path that cut through a patch of woods and led straight to her family's house on Willow Lane. She never made it. When Laura failed to return home by 11, her parents began to worry. By midnight, they were searching the streets. What they found was chilling. Her shoes and the small corsage she had worn to the dance lying abandoned at the side of the road. A single neighbor later reported hearing a scream, sharp and quick, but when they looked outside, there was nothing to see. Police responded with urgency. More than 200 volunteers combed through the woods, fields, and nearby lake. Dogs picked up a scent, only to lose it near the church parking lot. But there was no body, no signs of a struggle, and no clear suspect. All that was missing, besides Laura herself, was a silver bracelet engraved with her initials, a gift from her mother. Two suspects emerged early on, her violent ex-boyfriend and a troubled neighbor with a petty criminal record. Both denied involvement. Both remained under a cloud of suspicion for decades. As months turned into years, the case went cold. For the Bennett family, hope dimmed but never died. For the town, rumors hardened into myths and suspicion poisoned everyday life. And then, more than 20 years later, a chance discovery cracked the case open. A hidden box, a forgotten bracelet, and a name that stunned everyone, a man no one ever suspected. This is the story of the vanishing of Laura Bennett. 17-year-old Laura Bennett lived on Willow Lane in a quiet Ohio town where families knew each other and children grew up under the same watchful eyes. She was in her senior year of high school, full of plans for the future, surrounded by friends who saw her as reliable, kind, and easy to be around. She shared a modest home with her parents and younger brother, a house that was always filled with the routine sounds of family life. Nothing about her background suggested danger. Nothing about her life prepared her family for what would come. At school, Laura stood out for the right reasons. Teachers described her as bright and motivated, often placing her at the top of her classes. She had the grades and the ambition to move forward into college, something her family was deeply proud of. She wasn't a loner, but she wasn't the kind of girl who craved attention either. Laura simply did what she was supposed to do and did it well. Beyond academics, she played an active role in her community. She was a member of the cheerleading squad and also sang in the church choir. Neighbors often saw her helping with bake sales, fundraisers, or volunteering during church events. These activities gave her a strong presence in the community. People remembered her as the girl who always raised her hand to help, the one who rarely complained, and the one you could count on to follow through. Her personality matched her reputation. Friends described her as open, approachable, and the kind of person you wanted in your corner. She was not dramatic, not reckless. When arguments happened among friends, she often played the role of peacemaker. Even at 17, she had a maturity that made her stand out, someone who seemed grounded in a town where gossip and high school rivalries often ran wild. Her circle of friends was close-knit. Laura had a handful of best friends she spent most of her time with. Together, they studied, practiced for cheerleading, and planned small outings that gave them moments of joy in an otherwise predictable town. Laura wasn't the leader of the group, but she was often the glue that kept them connected. If someone was left out, she noticed. If someone needed support, she showed up. This sense of loyalty made her well-liked and respected among her peers. But like most teenagers, Laura's life wasn't without complications. She had once been in a relationship with Mark Holloway, a popular football player at the school. Mark was older, physically strong, and had a reputation for a temper that got him into trouble more than once. Their relationship had been rocky. Arguments escalated quickly, and by the time Laura decided to end it, tension had built up to the point where Mark's anger was hard to ignore. Witnesses remembered him making threats after the breakup, vowing that things weren't over. Those words, brushed aside at the time, would later cast a long shadow over the investigation. After the breakup, Laura began seeing someone else from a nearby school. It was a new relationship, still in its early stages. They went on casual dates and talked on the phone, but it hadn't yet become serious. Still, it was enough to signal that Laura was moving on with her life, leaving Mark behind, and looking toward new beginnings. This detail seemed small at the time, but it would matter later as police tried to piece together her relationships and motives for anyone who might want to harm her. One detail that always stood out about Laura was the silver bracelet she wore almost every day. It was engraved. Her background mattered because it sharpened the shock when she failed to return home. This wasn't a girl with a history of trouble. This wasn't someone with a secret life. Laura's record was clean, her friendships strong, and her family ties unshaken. That made her disappearance more alarming. It was sudden, unexplainable, and devastating for those who knew her. For her parents, every detail of Laura's life was a reminder of what they had lost. The bracelet, the cheerleading uniform in her closet, the stack of school books waiting for the next exam. Each one became a frozen moment in time, untouched as days turned into weeks, and weeks into years. In many ways, understanding who Laura was is the key to understanding the magnitude of this case. She was not someone who could simply vanish without notice. Her disappearance was not a choice, and it was not an accident that could be brushed aside. It was a crime that cut through the heart of her family, her friends, and the town itself. When people remembered Laura, they didn't remember scandal or controversy. They remembered her smile, her kindness, her willingness to step up. That's why the moment she disappeared, the community didn't just lose a girl. They lost a symbol of safety, a reminder that bad things weren't supposed to happen here. And in the years that followed, every rumor, every suspicion, and every false lead would circle back to this simple truth. Laura Bennett had been the kind of person everyone thought was safe, which only made her disappearance more haunting. October 15, 1983. The fall dance had just ended at the local high school. Music faded, decorations were being taken down, and clusters of teenagers poured into the cool night air. For most, it was a night of fun and laughter that would be remembered in photographs and stories. But for one student, it became the night she was last seen alive. At 10:45 p.m., witnesses saw 17-year-old Laura Bennett step out through the school doors. She told her friends she was heading home. The distance was short, 15 minutes at most. She had walked that route dozens of times before, a familiar path that cut through a wooded strip and connected straight to Willow Lane. Her friends assumed she would be fine. In a town where children rode bikes until dark and neighbors greeted each other by name, no one imagined danger waiting on that walk home. The first warning signs appeared at 11:15 p.m. Her parents noticed the house was still quiet. No sound of the front door opening, no footsteps upstairs. Concern grew quickly. Laura was not the type to stay out late without notice. By 11:30, her father had stepped outside, scanning the street. When minutes passed without an answer, both parents began searching the neighborhood themselves. What they discovered made their fears real. On the roadside leading out of the school, they found Laura's high-heeled shoes lying abandoned on the dirt shoulder. Beside them was the corsage she had worn that evening, now crushed and broken. These were not items she would have dropped casually. They were clear signs something had gone wrong. A nearby resident later reported hearing a short, sharp scream around the same time. It came from the direction of the wooded path. The witness looked out the window but saw nothing. No car, no figures, only silence. By the time they considered checking further, the sound was gone. That fleeting moment, overlooked in the dark, would later weigh heavily in the investigation. When police arrived, they studied the scene closely. The ground showed no sign of a struggle. No drag marks, no scuff patterns in the dirt. There was no blood, no personal belongings scattered, no purse or jacket left behind. For investigators, it was as if Laura had simply vanished between the school doors and her front porch. Neighbors joined the Bennetts that night, carrying flashlights into the woods and across the open fields. They called Laura's name again and again, their voices carrying into the cold air. Hours passed with no response. Searchers pushed deeper into the trees along the creek bed, across the parkland where teenagers often gathered. There was nothing. By the early morning hours, the police had mobilized a larger response. Officers established a command post near the school and coordinated dozens of volunteers. A grid search of the woods was launched at first light. Every ditch, every clearing. The media moved quickly. By that afternoon, Laura's face was on local television screens and in newspapers. Reporters described her as the Willow Lane girl, and the coverage drew more volunteers into the search effort. Helicopters scanned the countryside. Teams searched the riverbanks and farmland. Yet as days turned into weeks, the same conclusion was repeated. There was no trace. The missing bracelet became another key point in the investigation. Laura's mother confirmed that her daughter always wore a silver bracelet engraved with Laura B. It was not found with the shoes or the corsage. It was not in her room. Investigators believed the bracelet had been taken during the disappearance, either lost in the struggle or removed deliberately. As the weeks dragged on, the absence of evidence fueled rumors. Some whispered that Laura had run away with a secret boyfriend. Others insisted that she must have been taken by someone she knew. The discovery of her shoes and corsage, so carefully left on the roadside, made the idea of a voluntary disappearance difficult to accept. This was not a girl leaving town on her own terms. This was someone being silenced on a quiet October night. By November, the Bennett family had exhausted themselves with sleepless nights and endless searches. Candlelight vigils were held at the high school, where classmates clutched photographs and prayed for her return. Police maintained an active presence, but with no body, no vehicle, and no suspect, the case reached a wall. For the town, the effect was immediate. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Parents escorted their teenagers to and from every event. Doors that once remained unlocked were now bolted. The disappearance of one girl had changed the rhythm of daily life, creating a climate of suspicion and fear. The case file from those early days told the same story in stark detail. The last sighting at 10:45, the missing items on the roadside, the scream no one fully investigated, the scent trail that ended near the church. A timeline of ordinary events that ended in an extraordinary void. By the end of that first month, the official search was scaled back. Flyers still hung on bulletin boards. The Bennetts still left their porch light on every night. Wait. The night Laura Bennett vanished, the search began within hours. Police in the small Ohio town reacted quickly, at least on the surface. Dozens of officers were called in, joined by hundreds of volunteers. Neighbors grabbed flashlights, farmers opened their fields, and students from the high school came back out into the night to look for the girl who had not returned home. Through the early hours, the wooded path where Laura was last seen was combed again and again. The line of flashlights swept across the trees, through the brush and into the ditches. Dogs were brought in before dawn. Their noses picked up Laura's scent near the school, carried it down the path, but then lost it suddenly at the church parking lot. For detectives, that single detail was alarming. It suggested she hadn't walked further. It suggested she was taken, forced into a car, vanishing without leaving a trace behind. By morning, the search had expanded. The riverbanks were scanned, the empty fields around town searched in tight grids, and helicopters hovered over the countryside. But every sweep ended the same way. Nothing. Inside the Bennett home, investigators checked for signs that Laura had planned to leave on her own. Her purse sat on her desk. Cash, clothes, school papers, everything was untouched. No diary entries hinted at running away. There were no late-night calls on the family phone. Her friends told police she hadn't made plans to meet anyone after the dance. It was clear. Laura did not disappear by choice. One object quickly became central in the investigation. Her silver bracelet, engraved with Laura B., the gift from her mother. She never took it off. Yet it was missing, not found with her shoes or corsage, not left behind in her room. Police wrote it down as a possible key piece of evidence, but in the 1980s, without modern DNA testing, there was little they could do. Witness accounts trickled in. One neighbor living near the wooded stretch told investigators they had heard a scream, sharp, short, and then silence. They looked outside, but saw nothing. A couple driving through town reported noticing headlights near the path at the same time Laura would have been walking home. They couldn't describe the vehicle in detail, only that the lights moved quickly and disappeared down the road. Detectives returned to the high school and interviewed more than 100 students, teachers, and staff. No one recalled Laura leaving with anyone. No one saw her step into a car. No one noticed anything unusual in those final minutes at the dance. She had walked out alone. That was the last verified sighting. As the hours turned into days, the media arrived. Reporters covered the case intensely, dubbing it the Willow Lane Mystery. Laura's photograph appeared in newspapers across Ohio. Radio stations broadcast appeals for information. The coverage fueled fear, but also pressure. Police were expected to deliver answers, and quickly. Inside the station, suspicion turned toward two familiar names: Mark Holloway, the ex-boyfriend known for his temper, and Daniel Carter, the quiet neighbor with a petty theft record. Rumors spread faster than the facts. Half the town believed Mark must have snapped. The other half whispered that Daniel had been obsessed and had finally acted. Detectives leaned into those suspicions, circling the same names, repeating the same interviews. But as they pressed, the hard evidence wasn't there. Mark claimed he had been with friends that night, though no one could confirm it clearly. Daniel said he was at home alone, no alibi to back him up. Both looked suspicious. Both had motives the town could imagine, yet neither could be tied to the scene. No fingerprints, no fibers. No vehicle sightings to match them. Weeks of searching led to the same empty conclusion. There was no body, no weapon, no crime scene. Investigators had only the shoes, the corsage, and stories of a scream in the night. As winter approached, cracks in the investigation began to show. Resources were stretched thin, but more than that, discipline slipped. Reports went unfiled. Leads sat for days before follow-ups. One deputy admitted that evidence from the roadside was bagged but never tested properly, sitting in storage while the case moved forward without it. Detectives missed chances to re-interview key witnesses while memories were still sharp. The family begged for urgency. Laura's parents went door to door with flyers, mailed letters to the state police, even pleaded on local TV for renewed effort. But behind closed doors, morale in the department was low. Some officers openly suggested Laura had simply run away, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Others insisted the case was unsolvable, already cold. By early 1984, the search had lost momentum. The once massive grids had been reduced to small weekend sweeps. The town began to lose faith. Parents no longer trusted the police to protect their children. Friends of Laura criticized investigators for chasing rumors while ignoring broader possibilities. In coffee shops and church halls, people whispered that the department had botched the case from the start. By the end of that year, the file on Laura Bennett remained open, but it sat heavier on the shelf. The words "active investigation" no longer carried weight. The Bennett family's porch light burned every night, a signal of hope. But inside the station, the energy had faded. The trail was cold, and the girl from Willow Lane was still gone. What began with a surge of lights, dogs, and helicopters ended with silence and doubt. Laura's disappearance was no longer just a tragedy. It was now a mystery clouded by failures. A town left without answers. A family left without justice. And a police force already showing that the truth could slip away, even when it was right in front of them. The night of October 15th, 1983, the timeline of Laura Bennett's disappearance was painfully tight. She left the high school at 10:45 p.m. She was last seen walking toward the wooded path that led to Willow Lane. Around 11 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing a scream, brief, sharp, and then gone. At 11:15, Laura's parents were already outside, alarmed that she had not returned. They began searching within minutes. The critical window stretched no more than half an hour. Within that short frame, Laura vanished without a trace. For investigators, the challenge was immediate. Match this timeline against potential suspects. Every minute mattered. And two names rose quickly to the surface: Mark Holloway and Daniel Carter. Mark Holloway was 18, a senior at the same school, and Laura's ex-boyfriend. He was well known in town as a football player, strong, confident, and quick to anger. Teachers recalled fights on the field and in the hallways. His record included detentions, minor suspensions, and at least one arrest for disorderly conduct. His relationship with Laura had ended badly. Friends remembered arguments in the school parking lot. Laura's parents recalled her Detectives brought Mark in for formal questioning. From the start, his temper showed. He denied any involvement, accused the police of harassing him, and raised his voice when pressed about Laura. Investigators leaned hard into the history of threats and the bitter breakup, framing a scenario where he had confronted Laura on her walk home. Mark snapped back, insisting he had nothing to do with it. When offered a polygraph, he agreed. The results came back inconclusive. Not a pass, not a fail. Just more fuel for suspicion. Police searched Mark's car and clothing. No blood, no fibers. No mud linking him to the wooded path. Friends admitted he had been drinking that night, but no one placed him near the church or the roadside where Laura's shoes and corsage were found. The physical evidence refused to cooperate. The second name was Daniel Carter. He was 19, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down from the Bennetts. Unlike Mark, Daniel wasn't popular or athletic. He had dropped out of school, worked odd jobs, and kept to himself. His record included a petty theft charge for shoplifting, and rumors suggested he had a quiet fascination with Laura. Some said he lingered near her yard. Others claimed he had once asked her out and been turned down. For police, that was enough to draw attention. Daniel's alibi was weaker than Mark's. He said he had stayed home alone watching television. The TV was found on, but no one could confirm the time. He first told detectives he had gone to bed early, then later changed his story to say he had stayed up late. The inconsistency raised eyebrows. When strapped to a polygraph, Daniel grew nervous. His results were also inconclusive. Detectives searched his small house and his truck. His clothes were freshly washed. The truck's tires were old and mismatched, not a match to any tire impressions near the wooded path. No trace of Laura, no bracelet, no fibers, nothing. The case quickly became a story of 2 men, both suspicious, both flawed, yet both without proof against them. Witnesses added fuel, but no clarity. A student reported seeing Mark and Laura arguing at school the week before. For investigators, the tunnel vision was real. They focused almost exclusively on Mark and Daniel. Leads about a possible third party were set aside. The church parking lot, where the dogs lost Laura's scent, was never fully investigated. Logs of vehicles entering and leaving were not collected. Witnesses who mentioned an unfamiliar car received little follow-up. The case narrowed too quickly. Forensic science in 1983 offered no rescue. There were no security cameras on the streets or near the church. The roadside dirt yielded no blood, no fingerprints, and no viable fibers. The shoes and corsage carried no useful trace. DNA analysis was years away. The missing silver bracelet, engraved Laura B., remained out of reach. Detectives knew if they could find it, they might solve the case. But without it, the investigation spun in circles. Warrants were executed at both suspects' homes. Mark's room contained sports gear, school books, and nothing to link him to the crime. Daniel's place contained tools, magazines, and his worn-out truck parked outside. Neither held evidence that tied them to Laura's disappearance. Surveillance was quietly placed on both men for weeks. Detectives hoped for a mistake, a slip, or an attempt to hide something. Nothing came. Both carried on with their lives, under the watchful eyes of neighbors who believed one of them was guilty. By late 1983, the investigation had reached a dead end. Neither Mark nor Daniel could be cleared, yet neither could be charged. Both men lived under suspicion, watched in grocery stores, whispered about in church, avoided by old friends. Mark grew bitter, quick to lash out at the constant stares. Daniel withdrew further, seen rarely outside his house. For the Bennetts, the suffering doubled. Not only was Laura gone, but the two young men closest to her life were trapped in the spotlight, their names tied to her disappearance. Every holiday, every community event, the same question hovered. Was it Mark? Was it Daniel? By the start of the 1990s, the case had quietly shifted into long-term monitoring. Files were moved into the cold case cabinet. Detectives admitted privately that without a body, without a confession, they would never secure a conviction. And so the years dragged on. Mark tried to build a life, always under the weight of suspicion. Daniel lived in isolation, spoken of in hushed tones. Both carried the scars of a crime they did not commit, yet could never escape. For the town, the impact was lasting. The Bennetts left a light burning on their porch each night. The high school held annual memorials, and neighbors continued to wonder if the killer still lived among them. Part 5 closed without resolution. The suspects were obvious, the motives believable, but the evidence missing. The tunnel vision of investigators blinded them to other possibilities. The case froze in time, locked in rumor and suspicion. What remained was silence, unanswered questions, and a file marked open but inactive. And as the years passed, Laura's name became a ghost in the community. Her story retold, but never solved. The truth was still out there, but for now, it was buried in the shadows of two men who would never be free of suspicion. The case was about to enter its coldest years. The search for Laura Bennett did not end overnight. It just slowed, then thinned, then slipped into routine. By early 1984, the case was labeled follow-up as needed. The lead detective moved to another unit. Notes in the file said the same thing again and again. No new leads. The Bennetts understood what that meant. If they wanted the town to remember, they would have to keep the light on themselves. Every October, they set a candle on the porch and a photo by the front window. They asked neighbors to share any tip, even a small one. The high school added a moment of silence to the fall dance. Friends wrote letters to the local paper telling people not to forget. Over time, the vigil became a symbol. Inside the department, resources moved to new cases. Homicides and active assaults took priority. The cold case team was small and often temporary. Lab queues stretched for months. Some of Laura's trace samples were too limited to test with the methods of the time. The shoes and corsage were preserved, but they gave nothing. The bracelet was still missing. Evidence storage was not built for decades of waiting. Boxes were moved as rooms were repurposed. Logs were handwritten and sometimes incomplete. The chain of custody was not broken, but it was thin. Humidity in the old property room worried the new clerk. He logged a note about it and requested better containers. He did what he could with the space he had. The case needed a new piece of evidence more than it needed a new box. Forensics had not caught up yet. There were no traffic cameras covering the road home. No private security pointed at the path by the trees. Tire tracks had been cast, but nothing matched them. Fiber comparisons did not land. DNA was a promise on the horizon, not a tool the town could use in 1984 or 1988 or 1992. Detectives wrote the same line in multiple memos. Reconsider for testing when technology allows. The Bennetts did not wait. They wrote to the county sheriff and the state police. They hired a private investigator to recheck the scream reported by the neighbor and the headlights seen near the path. Some details sharpened. None produced a suspect. The family set up a small reward fund and kept a phone line open for anonymous tips. A few calls came in. Most were vague. A handful were false leads. The family kept going, because stopping felt like losing her twice. The town changed under the weight of the case. Some residents blamed Mark. Others blamed Daniel. The divide lasted for years. Parents pushed for curfews for teenagers. Teachers offered to walk students to cars after evening events. Neighbors locked doors earlier. Strangers were watched. That is what a long unsolved case does. It makes people pick sides and hold on to them. Tips continued, but follow-up was uneven. One call mentioned a dark pickup passing the church at high speed the night Laura disappeared. Officers took notes, but there was no plate, and the make was uncertain. Another anonymous caller said a respected man had been seen stopping near the woods more than once. The caller had no date, no name, only a feeling. The lead did not go far. The most important clue, a scent that ended at the church lot, remained in the file without a matching suspect. In the mid-1990s, the small cold case group pulled the file for a structured review. They compared the tire casts and shoe prints against newer databases. No hits. They re-interviewed the neighbor who heard the scream. The memory was still clear, but it was still only a sound, not a face. Teams searched the woods behind the church again, this time with updated ground search patterns. The soil gave nothing away. The local paper ran a series titled, "Who Failed Laura?" It called out the early investigation for narrowing too fast and for missing follow-through at the church. The department responded with a careful statement. There was no usable evidence to act upon, and they were waiting for technology that could help. The public argued in letters to the editor, then fell quiet again. Outrage needs movement to stay alive. In the early 2000s, by the end of the cold case phase, the same facts sat on top. There was no body. There was no weapon. There was no direct witness. The bracelet was gone. Without that single item, there was nothing new to test. The file waited for something outside the daily work of detectives. The family waited for the call that never came. In 2007, the break did not start in a lab or at the station. It started at the church. The building was clearing out an old storage area to make space for renovations. Volunteers moved boxes that had not seen daylight in years. Dust rose. A small wooden box sat on a back shelf, unmarked and out of place. Someone opened it and saw a piece of silver and several faded Polaroids. They did not know what they were holding, but they knew to call the police. Inside was a silver bracelet, engraved with 2 letters, Laura B. The photographs were blurred but dated from the early 1980s. The bracelet matched the description the Bennetts had given the night their daughter vanished. The property room clerk signed it in with care. Detectives called the family. Then they called the lab. The questions came fast. Why was Laura's bracelet in a church storage room? Who had access to that room in 1983? What records showed the keys, the locks, and the volunteers? The case that had sat still for more than 20 years suddenly had a direction. Not a rumor, not a hunch. A physical link. The lab used modern techniques that had not existed in 1983. They tested the bracelet and what it had been stored with. They handled the Polaroids with caution. Results would take time, but for the first time in years, time was working for the Bennetts. The evidence had survived. It could speak now. Cold cases often turn on a simple fact. Something gets found. Something that should not be where it is. Here, it was a bracelet in a box that no one had catalogued, in a room that sat beside the very lot where the dogs lost Laura's scent. The path home. The scream. For more than 2 decades, Laura's case was nothing but silence, doubt, and a light left burning on a porch. But in 2007, one forgotten box changed everything. What do you think was really hidden inside that church storage room? And why did it stay there for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the next part, we uncover the moment investigators finally opened that box. And with it, the truth that had been buried for 24 years. March 2007. A quiet spring morning in Willow Lane. The local church announced a renovation project. Storage rooms that had not been touched in decades were finally being cleared. Volunteers moved dusty boxes, old hymn books, broken chairs, and forgotten decorations. Among the clutter, one volunteer noticed a small wooden box. It was unmarked, covered in dust, wedged behind larger containers. Out of curiosity, they opened it. Inside was something that stopped them cold. A silver bracelet engraved with the initials, Laura B. And next to it, several blurred Polaroid photographs. The volunteer froze. The bracelet was not just any piece of jewelry. It matched the description of the gift Laura Bennett had received from her mother for her 17th birthday. A bracelet Laura was said to wear every single day of her life. A bracelet that disappeared the same night she did. The volunteer immediately called the church supervisor. Within hours, local police were contacted. By the afternoon, county investigators arrived, sealed the box, and transported it to the state forensic lab. A formal evidence report was filed. For the first time in 24 years, a new lead in the disappearance of Laura Bennett was in police custody. The discovery shook the Bennett family. When detectives showed them the bracelet, Laura's mother broke down. She confirmed without hesitation it was Laura's. She had chosen it herself, engraved her daughter's name, and had given it to her only months before that October night in 1983. For the investigators, the bracelet was more than sentimental. The breakthrough raised new questions. If it wasn't Mark, if it wasn't Daniel, then who had handled Laura's bracelet? And why was the evidence hidden in the church storage room all this time? Detectives turned their attention to the location. The church had been central to the community in 1983. It was a place Laura herself had sung in the choir. It was also only a short walk from the route she took home after the fall dance. Police pulled church records. They listed who had keys, who had regular access, and who was in charge of the storage rooms at the time Laura vanished. The list was short. The pastor, a few members of the church board, and some long-term volunteers. One name immediately stood out: Reverend Paul Matthews. He had been the pastor in 1983, a man of deep community standing, the face of the church, a man who had comforted families, led Sunday prayers, and delivered eulogies for generations. He was also the same man who had organized vigils for Laura after her disappearance, the same man who had prayed with the Bennett family, the same man who had stood in front of reporters and begged for justice. For nearly a quarter of a century, no one had questioned him. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigative team, but they had to move carefully. DNA evidence placed a new suspect on the board, but it did not yet explain how Laura's belongings had ended up inside that box. The press caught wind of the discovery before long. Local newspapers ran bold headlines: "Breakthrough in Laura Bennett case after 24 years." Television anchors called it the most important cold case development of the decade. Reporters flocked to Willow Lane. For the town, it was like reopening an old wound. After years of silence, the case was suddenly alive again. The Bennetts reacted with a mix of hope and pain. For them, the bracelet was proof their daughter's story was not forgotten. Her case was still moving forward. Mark Holloway, once the prime suspect, gave a statement through a local paper. He said, "The pieces were beginning to align. The bracelet had been kept hidden in a place only a handful of people could reach, and the man who had always been considered above suspicion was at the center of it. Still, police needed hard proof. Rumors and suspicion were not enough. They needed to compare the recovered DNA with Matthews himself. Behind the scenes, pressure built. Detectives arranged for a warrant. Matthews was now a 69-year-old man, still serving in a reduced pastoral role, still respected, still trusted. When the request came to provide a DNA sample, he complied, believing he had nothing to fear. The sample was sent to the same lab. The wait was tense. The town buzzed with speculation. For the Bennetts, it was almost unbearable. And then the results arrived. The match was clear. The male DNA found on Laura Bennett's bracelet belonged to Reverend Paul Matthews. The case that had stood still for 24 years was now exploding into the open. The man who had led prayers for justice was about to be exposed as the killer. The discovery of the bracelet did not just reignite an old investigation. It shattered the foundation of trust in a town that had believed in its pastor. It freed two innocent men from decades of suspicion, and it set the stage for the shocking confession and trial that were still to come. For the first time in decades, the path toward justice for Laura Bennett was visible. The laboratory report came back in early 2007. The swab lifted from the silver bracelet engraved Laura B. revealed a male DNA profile. When compared against the national database, and then against the stored samples of both long-standing suspects, the result was unmistakable. It was not Mark Holloway. It was not Daniel Carter. The match was 100% to Reverend Paul Matthews, the minister who had served Willow Lane Church for more than 3 decades. Within hours, prosecutors secured a warrant. Detectives moved fast. They sealed the church storage area, Matthews' office, and his vehicle. A second team executed a search warrant at his home. The orders were clear: locate any material connected to the Bennett case and secure the chain of custody that had been so badly missed. The first round of interrogation brought only denial. Matthews claimed his duties in the 1980s included organizing storage. His explanation was simple. If his DNA was on the bracelet, it must have been transferred while handling boxes. He could not, however, explain why Laura's bracelet, missing since the night she vanished, ended up locked away in the church basement. His story cracked when detectives laid out the sequence. The bloodhounds had lost Laura's trail at the church parking lot in 1983. The bracelet surfaced in the church storage area in 2007. And the DNA on that bracelet was his. Matthews shifted his account of the night. He first said he had been home. Then he said he had been preparing sermon notes late at the church. Each revision made him less credible. Hours later, under the pressure of mounting evidence, Matthews faltered. He admitted he had seen Laura walking that night. He stopped his car and offered her a ride. She declined. He insisted again. When she resisted, he forced her into the car. According to him, the struggle escalated and she died during the confrontation. He called it an accident, but avoided every detail that might clarify how her life had actually ended. He confessed that he drove her body behind the church and concealed it in the woods. Too afraid to move it further, he returned later to cover the shallow grave with brush. The silver bracelet, he said, he kept as a reminder. He placed it, along with some Polaroids of the wooded paths, into the church storage. For more than 2 decades, those items sat there unnoticed. The motive was simple and devastating. Anger at rejection combined with the arrogance of a man protected by trust and authority. He had lived for years believing no one would question a minister, especially at a time when there were no cameras, no DNA testing, and limited forensic resources. He had been right, until 2007. Investigators returned to the site Matthews identified. A forensic team dug into the soil where the woods met the church boundary. Within days, they uncovered skeletal remains. Fragments of clothing matched what Laura had been wearing at the fall dance. The bones confirmed female, late teen age, consistent with Laura Bennett. Trauma indicators aligned. The revelation exonerated the 2 men who had carried suspicion for almost a quarter century. Police and prosecutors held a press conference, announcing that Mark Holloway and Daniel Carter were officially cleared. They admitted the DNA evidence proved neither had played any role. Officers publicly apologized for the years of suspicion. Their names were removed from the case file as persons of interest. For Mark, it was both relief and bitterness. He had spent half his life branded as violent and dangerous. For Daniel, it meant release from decades of whispers and side glances. The apology could not erase lost years, but it lifted a weight neither should ever have borne. The community's response was shock bordering on disbelief. Parishioners who had turned to Matthews for weddings, funerals, and weekly sermons could not reconcile the man they knew with the crime he admitted. The church issued a statement suspending him immediately, pledging full cooperation with law enforcement and promising to review how property access had been managed. For a town raised on trust in its clergy, the betrayal cut deeper than anyone could measure. In preparation for trial, prosecutors compiled a formidable set of evidence: the DNA match, Matthews' own confession, the discovery of Laura's remains in the spot he indicated, the bracelet, the Polaroids, and the maintenance records showing his repeated access to the storage area. Matthews' attorneys argued for manslaughter, framing the death as unintended. But the physical evidence and the deliberate concealment undercut any claim of accident. Internally, the police department conducted a review of the original investigation. The findings were blunt. Detectives in 1983 had developed tunnel vision. They had locked on to Mark and Daniel while failing to pursue other leads. Tips about vehicles near the church had not been fully followed. The possibility of church involvement had been dismissed without serious inquiry. The report called for reforms, stricter chain of custody, mandatory evidence reviews when technology advances, and renewed training to avoid narrowing focus too early. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. The killer had not been the jealous ex-boyfriend or the troubled neighbor. It was the minister, the man who led prayers for Laura, who comforted her family, who spoke from the pulpit while her body lay hidden only a short walk away. The bracelet he kept became the thread that finally pulled the entire case out of darkness. After 24 years. The town now waited for the courtroom reckoning. The indictment listed murder in the first degree. The evidence was airtight. The Bennett family prepared to sit in court, finally able to look at the man responsible. For them, and for the community, the question was no longer who killed Laura. That answer was clear. The only question left was what sentence Paul Matthews would face, and whether it would be enough to balance 2 decades of silence, suspicion, and grief. The indictment came first. A grand jury returned murder in the first degree. Prosecutors filed a clean list of proof. The DNA from the silver bracelet engraved Laura B., the recorded and transcribed confession, skeletal remains found where Paul Matthews said they would be. Jury selection took days. Anyone closely tied to the church or the Bennett family was removed. Each juror promised to weigh the case without favor for a minister or for grieving parents. The standard was repeated until it stuck, beyond a reasonable doubt. Opening statements set the line of battle. The prosecution walked the timeline. 10:45 p.m., Laura leaves the school dance. About 11 p.m., a neighbor hears a single scream. The scent trail ends at the church lot. 24 years later, the bracelet appears in a church box. The DNA is Matthews. The confession fills the gaps. The remains behind the church confirm it. The defense told a different story. A tragic accident, no intent to kill. A man of service, decades of good works. They asked the jury to consider manslaughter. Forensics took the stand. The DNA analyst explained extraction from the inner surface of the bracelet, controls against contamination, and the statistics of a 100% match. The message was simple. The man who handled that bracelet was Paul Matthews. The forensic anthropologist followed. Female, late teen. Injuries consistent with a violent struggle. There was no soft tissue, so a precise mechanism was impossible. But the bones, the location, and the confession were consistent with homicide. Investigators described the dig site, the grid mapping, and the recovery. Photos showed a shallow grave, roots grown through disturbed soil, and a fragment of dress fabric. The handler from 1983 read from old notes. The dogs led to the church lot and stopped. It fit. Neighbors and family confirmed the night. The scream near 11. The parents beginning to search by 11:15 p.m. The bracelet described as a birthday gift that Laura never removed. The state then turned to the trophy. The bracelet and the unmarked wooden box were brought into evidence. The Polaroids appeared on a screen, dark paths, a car's lights spilling across brush, the same boundary behind the church. The property officer walked the jury through chain of custody from 2007 to the present. Then the state played parts of Matthews' confession. He admits stopping the car. He admits forcing Laura inside. He admits a fight. He admits her death. He admits hiding the body behind the church. He admits keeping the bracelet. On cross, the defense pressed accident. They pointed to blanks in the confession, to the missing cause of death. The prosecutor came back to concealment. Burying a body and keeping a souvenir are not the acts of a man facing a tragic mistake. They are the acts of a killer who thought he would never be caught. Character witnesses for the defense spoke about decades of weddings, funerals, and Sunday mornings. The prosecutor asked each the same question: does community service cancel a crime? The answer under oath was no. A defense expert suggested false confession risk under stress. The state answered with the map, the bracelet, the DNA, the remains at the exact location only the killer knew. Closings were sharp. The prosecution laid out a chain with no missing links. The intercept, the scream, the cut scent, the hidden remains, the bracelet Matthews held, the DNA he left, the confession that tied it all together. Intent, they argued, showed itself in force, in concealment, and in the decision to keep a piece of the victim's life. The defense asked for doubt. No camera, no precise cause. A man who said it was an accident and lived well for years. They asked for a lesser count. The jury did not take long. They sent a note that they had reached a verdict. Everyone stood. Guilty. Murder in the first degree. In the second row, the Bennett family held one another. Across the aisle, church members stared at the floor, silent. Sentencing followed. The judge spoke about trust, about the power a pastor holds in a small town, and about the weight of hiding a young woman's body for nearly a quarter of a century. Life without the possibility of parole. The court cited aggravating factors: abuse of position, deliberate concealment, and the enduring harm to the community. Victim impact statements closed the proceeding. Laura's father described 24 Octobers of waiting by a lit porch light. Her mother spoke about the bracelet she had chosen for her daughter, and how that small circle of silver carried the truth back when everything else failed. Her brother said his childhood ended the night she never came home. The court then addressed Mark Holloway and Daniel Carter by name. The record would reflect their exoneration. The DNA excluded them. The confession excluded them. The court expressed regret for the years that the church announced a review of property access and evidence handling on its grounds. It funded counseling sessions for parishioners. Town halls began. People asked how to rebuild trust when the pulpit had been used by a murderer. There were no easy answers. A plaque for Laura went up at the high school. A memorial bench was placed near the edge of the church woods, facing the trees that had kept the town's secret. The police department released an internal report. Tunnel vision, it said plainly. Early focus on 2 suspects had blinded the team to other paths. Tips about a car near the church were shelved. The recommendation list was long. Routine cold case reviews when science advances, strict chain of custody standards, mandatory second look protocols when evidence points to locations tied to authority figures. Funding arrived for better evidence storage and statewide lab partnerships. The case moved to television and print. Cold case files aired a segment. Long-form articles followed, using Laura's file to show what modern DNA can do, and what happens when investigations narrow too soon. The Bennett family launched Laura's Light, a small scholarship and a campaign for evidence preservation and family rights in cold cases. What remained was the final act of care. The Bennetts took Laura's remains home. A small service was held. Friends from school returned as adults. The porch light that had burned for 2 decades was turned off that night, not for forgetting, but because the waiting had ended. In the end, the verdict did more than punish a killer. It corrected the record for 2 innocent men. It forced a town to confront the blind spot that hid a crime in plain sight. And it proved that a single piece of evidence, a bracelet engraved with a girl's name, could carry a voice across 24 silent years and bring the truth into the open. Laura Bennett would not be forgotten.